Iraq's Prime Minister meets with President Obama at the White House as the United States prepares to pull out the last of its troops. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. After nearly 9 years of war, the United States is pulling out the last of its troops from Iraq. Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki is visiting the White House to discuss the next phase in the US-Iraq relationship. Iraq is now nominally a democracy, but its security remains fragile. The chief spokesman for US forces there warns, quote, Iraq remains a dangerous place, end quote, and that there could be a resurgence of al-Qaeda. US Vice President Joe Biden visited Iraq recently to mark what he called the end of an era. There were protests against his trip, though. Meanwhile, the US and Iraq have several issues to resolve in their future relationship. First, what role the 16,000 US personnel remaining in Iraq will play. That number includes contractors and diplomats. Big oil firms, some from the US, are already cutting controversial deals in northern Iraq that have angered Baghdad. Iraq may want Washington to mediate its thought. And in a shifting Middle East, the US needs Iraq as a strong ally. Iraq's Prime Minister, though, also has close ties with Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. Richard Armitage was the second highest ranking State Department official during the Iraq invasion. We discussed the level of US influence in Iraq 9 years on.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of our having control. Certainly what some would call a colonial period has ended, and we have the opportunity to pick up somewhat more of a partnership. Whether that will be the case or not, it's too soon to tell.
Right, but is it really realistic to think that the US simply cheers a sovereign Iraq and walks away? Surely they have an enormous interest in trying to have as much control as possible.
Not only an enormous interest, we've had an enormous sacrifice of almost 4,500 servicemen and women. So we do have an interest, but we don't have the ability to ourselves map out Iraq's future. This is a democracy. You may not like it, may not like what the democratic process gives you, but it is a democracy.
Is this very different then to what you envisaged when you and others at the think tank, the Project for a New American Century, began lobbying for an invasion of Iraq in the 90s?
Yes, in my view, it certainly is different. I can make both arguments. I can make the argument that we've succeeded somewhat because it is a democracy, there is a written constitution, women's rights are enshrined in it, etc. I can also make the opposite argument that we've ceded much too much of the interest to Iran, and it becomes a playground for others, which is not what we envisioned.
And that's the point, and that's what causes some concern. It's difficult not to reach the conclusion when you look at the enormity of the US diplomatic, in quotes, presence in Iraq that will remain, that the US is looking at Iraq as a potential battleground for proxy battles in the region.
Well, I'd hope not. I'd hope that they were looking for Iraq as a prospective moderating pillar in the region, which is quite a bit different from the way you characterized it.
But what do 15,000 State Department personnel do?
Well, first of all, a great majority of them are security personnel. We've got full range of interest in Iraq, political, cultural, social, and security, and all business as well. So all of those things will be the task of the State Department.
But you've already suggested there are concerns about other regional powers. What will they be doing in relation to those regional powers, like Iran, for example?
I'd like to hear personally from Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. If he says he's a nationalist, he puts national interest above all else, and he won't let anyone interfere in the business of Iraq. And if that's the case, that's great. And it'll be a very good message for the United States to hear.
Right, but again, it's very difficult for us to take Nouri al-Maliki seriously as a nationalist if there are 15,000 State Department personnel. Isn't the US still interfering?
Well, I think Nouri al-Maliki will make that decision. He was certainly bold enough to decide the U.S. security forces should leave. As I said, the colonial era is over. And if Nouri al-Maliki wants fewer U.S. State Department folks there, then he'll tell us.
Do you think then if Maliki did say to the U.S., we want the State Department personnel to leave, then the U.S. just has no choice, it will pack up?
As far as I'm concerned, the United States is not in the business of hanging around where we're not wanted.
So does that suggest that Maliki actually wants the U.S. presence?
I'm suggesting that maybe he needs a certain U.S. presence, and he needs a certain level of trainers from the U.S. There is a good deal of military equipment which is going to be left behind. I think it's beyond question that that is necessary.
How chastened do you feel the foreign policy establishment is in Washington at the experience of Iraq? How might that change future adventures?
Well, as I say, it's a little soon to know how this one's going to play out. If on the one hand, after maybe some initial violence, sectarian strife, we find that Iraq settles down and moves forward as an independent democratic nation, that's one thing, and it would lead people to one point of view. If on the other hand, the violence is enormous, and particularly violence directed against the United States, and it's seen as a failure by the Obama administration, then this would lead people to another conclusion.
So just to clarify that, are you expecting violence in Iraq now?
I've never not expected it.
Or an intensification of the violence now that the U.S. is leaving?
I wouldn't be surprised in the short term if there was a short-term intensification. It is my strong hope that after an initial period of exercising, that those who want to take part in the new Iraq will settle down and do so more constructively.
Oil, of course, is still a major issue which hasn't been sorted out. Joe Biden suggesting it's the glue that keeps Iraq together. Is it, or might it be the dynamite that explodes Iraq apart?
The three major areas of the country all have certain amounts of oil reserves. I don't know the exact figures. It would be hoped that the oil would be something that does bind them together rather than separate them. But as I say, it's too soon to tell. We'll find out if they can come up with a fair and verifiable oil sharing agreement.
In the event of any further deterioration in the security situation, whether because of oil or because of sectarianism or anything else, can you envisage a situation in which the U.S. returns to Iraq in any significant numbers?
Well, I can envision a situation in which the U.S. may be involved in relieving our own personnel, getting State Department people out. But I think what you're suggesting is a longer-term presence, and I can't imagine it.
So, what role will the United States play in the new Iraq, and what is its legacy after 9 years of war? To discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Hillary Mann Leverett, a former White House and State Department official who worked in the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. Also joining us, Iraq analyst Raed Jarrar, and retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmit, the chief spokesman for the U.S. military in Iraq during the invasion. General, did the U.S. lose Iraq effectively?
Oh, I think if we take a look at Iraq right now, it's in a much better situation than it was as recently as 5 years ago. It is a democracy. It is at peace with its neighbors. It could very well be a bulwark against extremist threats inside the nation. I wouldn't consider what our soldiers have been able to do over the last 8 years and what they've accomplished as walking away from Iraq and having lost it. In fact, they should take great pride in what they've accomplished inside of Iraq, despite the tired arguments about why did we go in, how did we get there. Fact is, our soldiers went in there and did a marvelous job, a great sacrifice, at great risk, and so they should walk away, as the president said, with their honor intact and their heads held high, and I agree with that.
And there has been great sacrifice on all sides in this conflict. We can run through some of the grim accounting of this conflict. There are no definitive numbers of how many Iraqis have been killed, but estimates range from some 1 million, according to the Lancet Medical Journal, down to 150,000. At least 4,485 members of the US military have died, and more than 32,000 have been wounded. Many more suffer from disorders such as post-traumatic stress. The cost to US taxpayers is at least $800 billion, but that number is likely to rise given future costs, for example, providing healthcare and other benefits to war veterans. Raed Jarrar, then, for all of that cost, where is Iraq, both domestically and geopolitically, would you say?
I think everyone lost this war. No, there is no winners there. The U.S. wasted its treasure and reputation and blood on a war that should not have started in the first place. We're talking about a 20-year worth of violent conflict between Iraq and the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, other millions displaced. So I think everyone did lose, except for maybe a very small group of people in DC and some multinational companies. I think it's funny that the general counts just back 5 years. He says the situation is better than 5 years ago. Well, the war did not start 5 years ago. The war started 20 years ago in 1990 and 1991. And I think comparing this Iraq, the Iraq that is post-occupation, to the Iraq that existed in the 70s and 80s, it shows you the very bleak reality. Iraq is a torn war nation. It's a broken state. Millions of Iraqis left. The last time I visited Iraq, I did not know a single person in Baghdad. All of my family and friends left the country. So it's a disaster. I think the only good news today is that the US is ending its military occupation. This is very good. I think this will guarantee that Iraqis will work together in moving the country forward in the right direction.
And that is a point, Hillary Mann Leverett, that Iraq was sovereign enough to say no to the US when it wanted to stay. This wasn't just an Obama election campaign promise met. I mean, the US has effectively been kicked out, at least militarily. Was that one of the plans of those who lobbied so hard for the war at the outset, though, for a really sovereign Iraq?
No, clearly. The idea, the purpose of going into Iraq in 2003 was, in a sense, a neoconservative intellectual experiment. And the idea was, the plan was to transform Iraq and the Middle East into essentially secular democracies that would be, by definition, pro-American. And Iraq, as people said at the time, would be the leading light, the lighthouse for the rest of the Middle East. That was the idea, that each of these countries would become secular. Secular is key. Secular pro-American democracies that would then, by choice, align with the United States as the external power in the region. And that in itself has been a strategic failure. For as good or bad as Iraq is today compared to 5 years or 10 years ago, the key for the United States is this has been a strategic failure. And again, albeit our troops fought courageously, it's not a question of that, it's a question of strategic issues. Where is the United States today in the Middle East? We are on the run. The balance of power in the Middle East has been overturned, upturned and overturned. We had, in 2003, on the eve of the invasion, a pro-American alliance of states in the region, where Saddam Hussein was effectively contained. The Islamic Republic of Iran was very, very weak. Hezbollah, Hamas, these groups were nothing. They were weak. They had not been electorally legitimated in their internal processes. We were the clear, unsurpassed, unchecked superpower that could do anything we wanted in the Middle East at any time, and that's why we went into Iraq. Today, it's a very different scenario. Now we are constrained. We cannot go in now anywhere in the United States. Compare President Obama, when he was looking to give his speech to the Muslim world upon his inauguration, he could have gone anywhere. He chose Cairo, but everyone wanted him. He went to Turkey. He could have gone anywhere. Today, I don't think President Obama would be welcome anywhere in the Muslim world to give a speech.
We'll talk further about the future U.S. strategy in the region in a moment, but first of all, our Inside Story team did ask people in Washington, D.C. what they thought the U.S. legacy in Iraq will be.
I think the legacy will be that we tried, didn't complete the task, and I'm not sure we could have.
Are we leaving a country that's going to be a friend to the United States? I don't think so.
I think it's going to leave behind failure, quite frankly. If we pull out too early.
I hope that what America has done in Iraq hasn't caused too much damage to families, and I'm sorry if it has, but I really do hope that the message of democracy in Iraq stands.
Raed Jarrar, then, I mean, there is then this newfound power, perhaps, in the Iraqi government to resist the US. As far as a future US military presence is concerned, there is that effectively over now? Are there still attempts to keep a military presence in
I think
Iraq?
the good news this morning was that the NATO announced that they will withdraw by the end of the year. There was one last attempt by the US military to keep a few thousand troops under the NATO umbrella. It seems that that failed, and this is excellent news for Iraq and the region. I think with the end of the US military presence, this does, of course, pose a lot of questions about the non-military US presence in Iraq. The large question there, of course, is that how come the US will maintain 16,000 personnel in Iraq at the same time that Iraq is maintaining a few dozen personnel in DC? I think Iraqis do view this relationship as a peer-to-peer relationship. Many people from the US would love to continue the unbalanced relationship where the US controls Iraq, but Iraqis want this relationship to turn into an equal relationship, that the Iraqi representation in DC is equal to that of the US in Iraq.
Militarily, though, General, is it simply a matter of the US now saying, all right, then we've lost this one, we'll double down in other Gulf areas. We'll still have a huge presence in the Middle East. And then there's much talk of pivoting to the Pacific and so forth. Or is this all rather glib? I mean, how does it all work?
Well, I think it is glib. I mean, the fact remains is that the reason the U.S. military felt that they needed to stay inside of Iraq was because even the Iraqi military themselves said we are unable to guarantee the security of this country until 2020. The presence of American soldiers was not there, as some would suggest at this table, for some imperial reasons, or for some reasons of blood and treasure. It was simply to ensure that when we handed over responsibility for security entirely to the Iraqi security forces, that they were in a position that they could do it themselves. They, by their own admission, are not yet ready. The reason we have 16,000 personnel remaining in, most of which are security contractors, is because of a broad recognition that there are security threats still remaining inside that country.
Would you dispute that, right?
I won't dispute that, but I will dispute the notion that the U.S. is some charity organization going around the world protecting states. We are not a charity organization. We are a country that is facing challenges here inside the U.S. that we have to deal with. And talking about Iraq as a country that needs security solutions is true, that is true. But the question at hand is who would solve these security issues? I say Iraqis, not Americans.
Well, the Iraqis would say they need the Americans to do that.
Which Iraqis?
For a period of time until the Iraqis are capable of doing it themselves.
Which Iraqis?
Well,
if that is the case,
General Babakir himself has said, we will not be ready to handle the internal and external defense of this country until 2020. We need the continued presence of the Americans, not to fight our wars, but to continue to train and equip and mature us. And we felt it and still feel it.
That's a phrase that's not going to go down terribly well.
No, as the Iraqi security forces. They understand that they are not yet a fully mature military. They need assistance. It takes us 10 years to train a sergeant. It takes us 20 years to train a battalion commander. And we're not there as a charity, you're absolutely right. But we felt that we had the responsibility to work side by side with those that fought and died alongside of us, so that when we left, a security vacuum was not created that would put all that work to rest.
Let's just assume something that is a little bit odd strategically. It assumes that Iraq didn't have a fully functioning military when we went in. The issue now is not whether or not Iraq has a fully functioning military, but whether Iraq has a fully functioning military that will be pro-American in shorthand. That will be with American doctrine, be able to train with American weapons, be completely an army that can function and work with the United States. The issue was Saddam Hussein had a military, a Soviet-trained, provided military, equipped military. It's to transition it into a pro-American military. That was the goal, and that probably does still need more time. Maybe
I think that's a misreading. In fact,
very quickly.
Let me say something here. The Iraqi military is facing a crisis, and I don't think many Iraqis will dispute that. But this crisis is not a crisis of training, as you're trying to portray it. It's not a crisis where we have to go mature Iraqis and treat them as kids to teach them how they, carry a gun. It is a crisis of legitimacy. It's a legitimacy crisis because the Iraqi armed forces are seen as puppet forces collaborating with a foreign invader. We are the foreign invader. Unless we understand that, I don't think we will get the point that helping the Iraqi military get this legitimacy will be through ending the military occupation.
Okay, but the military occupation then does appear to be ending, and that's as a result then a lot of focus then is on this huge diplomatic presence, and there is going to be a sizable operation now, estimated to cost $6.8 billion in Baghdad, that will remain. The focal point then, the US Embassy in Iraq, the largest in the world, 16,000 Americans remaining, the majority private security contractors. Between 6,000 and 7,000 will be in charge of security, protecting the US Embassy in Baghdad and 2 consulates, among other sites. Around 4,600 contractors will be training Iraqis to use US military equipment, we understand. That's according to the Washington Post. And sources suggest just over 1,700 personnel will be traditional embassy personnel, such as diplomats. It's unclear, though, how many CIA employees and contractors will be in the country. The agency, as you can imagine, doesn't release exact figures. Hillary Mann Leverett, why such a huge presence, and what are they trying to achieve?
I think that the United States is trying to hold on to whatever it can inside Iraq, because the whole project to go into Iraq was to, in a sense, and this is a simplistic version, but in a sense to have an elected pro-American secular polity. Now that's just not possible given the dynamics on the ground, who the people are, what their beliefs are, what their background is, what their history is. They will naturally ally with the states around them. They will naturally ally with Iran, with Turkey, with Syria. They will do that naturally. The United States, to have any influence in there whatsoever, is desperately trying to keep not just the 16,000 in the embassy, but we're trying to keep even 4,000 in Kuwait. The Kuwaitis don't want us to have the 4,000 there either, but we're trying to do it, I think, in really a desperate move to retain some strategic position, because otherwise Iraq will normally and naturally align with its neighbors, and that's problematic for us because we have chosen an antagonistic position vis-a-vis the principal neighbor, Iran.
And General Kimmit, you've talked about sovereignty and democracy in Iraq. Is it possible for an ally like Iraq to also be allied with countries like Iran, for example, or is that immediately simply thought of as a strategic threat that has to be squashed?
No, I don't think it has to be squashed at all. As Hillary generally said, the fact is geography is going to prevail. The fact is they have neighbors to the west that are Sunni, they have neighbors to the east that are Shia, Persian, Arab. We don't find in any policy statements that we somehow have to stay aligned with Iraq so that it prevents them from having relationships with their neighbors. Prime Minister al-Maliki said on his recent visit to Washington, D.C., we're friends with Turkey, we're friends with Iran, we're friends with Syria, we're friends with Saudi Arabia. It is clear that he sees his position in the region as being friendly to all, and that's one of the goals that was set out throughout. The notion that Iraq was at peace with its neighbors, and unlike the situation as recently as 10 years ago, it is currently at peace with its neighbors.
And are you convinced, Raed Jarrar, that that's an acceptable position for the United States and the 16,000 State Department staff who are going to be in Iraq? That Iraq will be left to its own devices geopolitically and regionally?
I don't think so. I think the main task of the 16,000 State Department personnel in Iraq will be to try to influence the Iraqi politics, whether these were domestic or regional. There is one point that I want to stress here, is that when we talk about the Iraqis in this debate, or other debates, the vast majority of the Iraqi people, according to all polls, were against the U.S. presence all along. The vast majority of Iraqi elected officials in the parliament were against the U.S. presence all along. This is actually the reason why we're leaving. We're leaving because the Iraqi parliament insisted that we have to leave before the end of this year, insisted that we will not be granted any immunities to our troops or contractors in Iraq. So to claim that the Iraqis want us there is such an old talking point. I thought it expired a few years ago.
Well, first of all, I didn't say that the Iraqis wanted us to stay there, but it is equally as incorrect to suggest that the Iraqi parliament threw us out. The Iraqi parliament was quite willing to have American soldiers stay on Iraqi soil. They just did not want to grant them the privileges and immunities that normally are associated with the SOFA. Same with the NATO forces as well. So you are certainly entitled to your opinions, and I respect those opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
We are running out of time, unfortunately, but Hillary Mann Leverett, though, there is this nightmare scenario, though, of Iraq becoming a proxy battleground, not just between regional players, but international players like the US and others. Is that too grim a proposition, or might that actually happen?
It may be a bit grim, only because even though Iraq, of course, has different kinds of neighbors and wants to have good relations with each of those, I think its principal concern is, and its priority, is to have good relations with Iran. It's a majority Shia government in Iraq. There are a lot of Shia, it's a majority of the population, that are going to naturally have connections and trade and ties to Iran. So that's going to be their priority. That is, by definition, going to be a problem for the United States, and by definition, it's going to be a problem for another major power in the region, Saudi Arabia. So when you continue to hear, stories out of Iraq, like we heard especially in August, when on one day I think there were 42 coordinated attacks inside Iraq, this violence. The Saudis are still there. It's not over for them. The other Sunni states, it's not over for them. But for the Iraqi government, the priority will be to have a good relationship with Iraq. And we saw that just last week when Prime Minister al-Maliki said that if the Assad government in Syria were overthrown by outside powers, Iraq would have to have a strategic partnership with Iran, because that is a threat to Iraq if there are Sunni powers taking over other governments there. And so you will increasingly see that point, dealing with Iran, to be a problem for Iraq for the United States and
Last 20
others.
seconds, Raed.
I just thought I don't really agree with this like very sectarian view of the region, Sunni Shiite, Sunni Shiite. This is not how the region works. Believe it or not, the same people who are against the U.S. presence in Iraq and who succeeded in ending the U.S. occupation are against the Iranian intervention in Iraq as well, or the Saudi intervention. So it's not really about sectarianism. It's about people fighting for the sovereignty of their nation states.
Raed Jarrar, Hillary Mann Leverett, General Mark Kimmit, thank you very much. That's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now, but we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.com. Join us again next time. Goodbye.